There's a particular way people look at you when they've already decided your life is a tragedy, and I'd been watching strangers give Maren Delacroix that look for 3 months before I finally understood why it made my chest tighten every single time. My name is Owen Castellano. I'm 31, and I restore furniture out of a converted barn workshop on the edge of Cedar Hollow, a small town in western North Carolina, where everybody knows everybody's business about a week before they know the actual facts. I took over the workshop from my Uncle Frank when arthritis finally beat him out of the trade, and I've spent 7 years since then sanding down other people's grandmother's dressers and rebuilding chairs that should have been thrown out decades ago, because I've always believed a thing worth loving is worth the trouble of fixing. I live alone in the small apartment above the shop, close enough to hear the saws creak in the cold, and far enough from town that most nights the only company I keep is sawdust and the radio. I'm not lonely in any way people would notice from the outside. I just hadn't found a reason yet to want the quiet any different. Maren came into my workshop on a Tuesday morning in early spring, carrying a wooden rocking chair that had lost most of one arm and half its varnish, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of someone who'd learned every inch of a room before she walked into it. She used a single forearm crutch on her left side, the kind with the cuff that wraps just below the elbow, and she set the rocking chair down on my workbench, with more strength than her frame let on before she'd said a single word. "This was my grandmother's," she said. "I was told you're the only person in 3 counties who still does real restoration instead of just gluing things and calling it fixed." "Depends who's telling," I said, running a hand along the chair's broken arm. "But I don't glue and call it fixed." "What happened to it?" "Moving truck happened to it. Second time this year something of hers has nearly gotten thrown away because somebody decided it wasn't worth the trouble." Something tightened behind her eyes when she said it, like the sentence carried more weight than the chair did. I told her I could have it done in 3 weeks, gave her a fair price, and she nodded, thanked me, and turned to leave with that same careful gait, refusing without a word the extended hand of a young man loitering by the door who'd clearly decided she needed help she hadn't asked for. I watched her navigate the uneven gravel of my lot without breaking stride, chin level, shoulders square, the posture of someone who'd had a great deal of practice not needing anybody's hand. It took me 2 more visits to learn her name properly, and another 2 after that before I understood why half of Cedar Hollow talked about her in the hushed, careful tone reserved for people they'd already decided to feel sorry for. She'd been a competitive trail runner once, good enough that the local paper still had a framed article about her hanging in the diner window from before a drunk driver crossed the center line on Route 19 4 years back, and took the use of her left leg below the knee along with most of the life she'd built around it. She wore a prosthesis now, fitted carefully enough that most strangers never clocked it until they saw the crutch she still used on rough ground, and she'd moved back to Cedar Hollow 18 months ago to help care for her aging father, taking a job doing the town's bookkeeping from a small office above the hardware store, because it paid steady, and asked nothing of her that her body couldn't give. I heard most of this secondhand, from the woman at the diner counter, from the mechanic 2 doors down who spoke of her in a hushed, respectful voice that still somehow managed to carry an undertone of pity, and I noticed early on how carefully Maren steered every conversation away from her own past, whenever it threatened to surface, redirecting with a quick, practiced ease that told me she'd had a great deal of experience deflecting exactly this kind of curiosity. What nobody in town seemed to understand, and what took me embarrassingly long to understand myself, was that Maren didn't want to be understood as a tragedy. She wanted to be understood as a person who happened to have survived one. I found that out directly the 3rd time she came by the workshop, ostensibly to check on the chair's progress, though I'd started to suspect by then that the chair had become as much an excuse for her as the fence line had once been for me with somebody else entirely different. She caught me watching her navigate the uneven threshold of the barn door, the old sliding track that had never sat quite flush, and something in my face must have given away the impulse I was fighting not to act on, because she stopped in the doorway and looked at me directly. "Don't," she said, not unkindly, but with an edge underneath it that told me this wasn't the first time she'd had to say it. "Don't feel sorry for me. I can see it starting on your face, and I'd rather you just say whatever the polite version of it is and get it over with than watch you try to hide it badly for the next hour." I set down the chisel I'd been holding and looked at her a long moment before I answered, because the honest thing to say wasn't the thing I think she was braced for. "I wasn't feeling sorry for you," I said. "I was watching you get through a doorway I've been meaning to fix for 2 years, because I never had a reason good enough to bother. Wasn't pity. Just noticing." Something in her shoulders eased, just slightly, like she'd expected to have to fight for a foothold she hadn't actually needed to fight for. "People usually aren't that specific about it," she said. "I work with my hands for a living. Specifics about all I've got." She almost smiled at that, and something about the almost stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit that night, sanding down her grandmother's rocking chair alone in a barn that suddenly felt quieter than it had any right to. Over the following weeks, the chair became an excuse we both stopped bothering to maintain the fiction of. She'd stop by after her bookkeeping hours, sometimes with coffee from the diner, sometimes empty-handed, and sit on the old stool by my workbench asking questions about grain and joinery that I don't think she actually needed answered so much as she needed a reason to stay another 20 minutes. I found myself slowing the repair down without admitting it to either of us, sanding one more pass than necessary, putting off the final coat of finish because I wasn't ready yet for the excuse to run out. She told me, in pieces, about the accident, not out of a need to be pitied, she was careful to make clear, but because she said it was easier to tell the truth plainly once than to spend the rest of a friendship watching someone tiptoe around a question they were too polite to ask. She told me about the 11 months of physical therapy, learning to walk again on a leg that wasn't there anymore in the way it used to be. She told me about the running club she used to coach, how most of them had stopped calling within a year. Not out of cruelty, she thought, but because grief made people clumsy, and clumsy people tend to just disappear rather than risk saying the wrong thing. She told me about a fiancé too, a man named Colton Reyes she'd been engaged to at the time of the accident, and the particular quality of her voice went flat and careful when his name came up, the tone of someone who'd rehearsed how to say a name without giving it any more weight than it had already taken. "He stayed 6 months, she said one evening, sanding a scrap of pine idly while I worked the chair's new arm into shape beside her. Said all the right things at the hospital. Said it didn't change anything. Then the physical therapy got hard, and the wedding got postponed once. Then twice. And one day he told me he thought we both needed space to figure out who we were now. I haven't heard from him since, except for a Christmas card 2 years ago that I'm fairly sure his mother made him send. I didn't offer her sympathy, because I'd learned by then that sympathy was the one thing guaranteed to make her go quiet and careful again. Instead, I said the only thing that felt true. Sounds like he wanted a version of you that was easier to love. That's not the same as loving you. She looked up at me sharply, like the sentence had landed somewhere she hadn't braced for, and didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its careful edge. Most people don't make that distinction. Most people haven't spent 7 years learning that the things worth keeping are the ones that take real work to fix. I said, "I don't throw out a chair because it's got a broken arm, Maren. Doesn't mean I don't see the break. Means I see what's worth saving underneath it." She didn't say anything else that evening, but she stayed until well past dark, the two of us working in comfortable silence broken only by the scrape of sandpaper and the occasional low murmur of the radio. And when she finally left, she paused in the doorway, the same doorway with the uneven threshold, and looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Something unguarded, before she caught herself and let the careful mask settle back into place. There was a Saturday not long after when a sudden rain caught us both off guard, the two of us hauling half-finished pieces away from the open barn doors, while thunder rolled over the hollow, and by the time we'd gotten everything under cover we were both soaked through and laughing, the kind of laughing that comes easier when nobody's watching to decide what it means. She stood in the middle of my workshop dripping onto the sawdust floor, hair plastered to her face, and said it was the first time in years she'd let herself get caught in weather, instead of calculating the safest, driest route around it. I handed her one of my old flannel shirts to change into, and when she came back out of the little bathroom off the workshop wearing it, sleeves rolled twice. I had to turn back to my workbench for a minute before I said something I wasn't ready yet to say out loud. Another evening, I found her sitting cross-legged on the workshop floor, with a stack of old photographs spread out around her. Ones she'd brought from her father's house because she said she wanted somebody outside her family to see who she'd been before the accident. Not to explain herself, just because she wanted to share it. There were pictures of her crossing finish lines, arms raised, number bib flapping, a version of her frozen mid-stride that looked nothing and everything like the woman sitting on my floor. I sat down beside her and looked through every one without saying a single sympathetic word, only asking about the races, the times, the towns she'd run through. And I watched something in her posture loosen with every question that wasn't really a question about the accident at all. "You're the first person who's looked at these and asked about the running, instead of what came after," she said quietly, gathering the photos back into their envelope. "The running's the part that still matters," I said. "The rest is just what happened to you. Doesn't have to be the whole story you tell." She was quiet a long moment, then reached over and took my hand, and we sat like that on the sawdust floor until the light outside went fully dark, and neither of us moved to turn on a lamp. There was a slower kind of intimacy that grew between us two, the kind built out of small, unremarkable evenings rather than any single dramatic moment. She started keeping a spare set of reading glasses on my workbench because she liked to sit with a paperback while I worked, and I started keeping a second coffee mug on the shelf that was, without either of us saying so, hers. Some nights we barely spoke at all, just existed in the same warm, sawdust-scented quiet, and I found that the silence with her never once felt like the silence I'd grown used to living alone above an empty shop. It felt like company. On the evenings her leg ached worse than usual, from weather or overuse, or simply the unpredictable toll of 4 years of adapting. She never once apologized for needing to sit longer, prop it up on an overturned crate, or cut a visit short, and I never once made her feel like she owed an explanation for any of it. I think that, more than anything, was the thing that finally let her stop watching my face for the flicker of pity she'd spent years learning to brace against. By early summer, the rocking chair had been finished for weeks, restored to a condition better than the day it was built, sitting proudly in the corner of my workshop because neither of us had said out loud that its purpose had quietly shifted from a repair job into a reason to keep seeing each other. She still came by most evenings. I'd started fixing that uneven threshold, finally, not because she'd asked, but because I'd stopped being able to watch her navigate it, without wanting to make her path easier in whatever small ways she'd let me. It was on one of those evenings, the light going gold and slow through the barn's high windows, that I finally said what I'd been carrying for weeks. She'd been quiet a while, turning a scrap of walnut over in her hands, and when I asked what she was thinking about, she set it down and looked at me directly, the same directness she'd used the day she told me not to feel sorry for her. "I keep waiting for you to get tired of this," she said. "Of me being careful all the time, of the doorways and the gravel, and the days my leg aches too much to walk the long way around. Everyone eventually gets tired of the careful version, Owen. Colton did. My old running club did. I've made peace with it being how people are built, but I don't know how to stop waiting for it from you." I set down my tools and crossed the small distance of the workshop floor and knelt in front of her stool, not out of any grand gesture, just because it put us at the same eye level, and took both her hands in mine. "I'm not waiting to get tired of you," I said. "I've been waiting 3 months to work up the nerve to tell you I'm in love with you, and every single day that's gone by has just made the waiting harder, not easier." Her breath caught, and I watched something behind her eyes brace itself, the old defense rising fast out of habit. "Don't feel sorry for me," she said again, quieter this time, less certain, like she was testing whether the old line still held against what I'd just said. "I'm not," I said, holding her gaze steady. I'm in love with you, not the careful version, not the version that gets around a broken doorway without complaint. All of it. Maren, the whole person who walked into my shop 3 months ago and told me not to pity her. Because I never did. I just noticed you. I've been noticing you every day since." She didn't say anything for a long moment, and when the tears finally came, they came quietly, without the careful control she usually kept over everything, and she let me hold her there on that workshop floor surrounded by sawdust and half-finished chairs, the two of us not saying anything else, because nothing else needed saying yet. I want to be honest, because the story doesn't get simple just because the hardest sentence finally got said out loud. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon that started ordinary enough, Colton Reyes walked into my workshop uninvited, looking for Maren, and everything about our quiet, careful summer got a great deal louder. I recognized him before he introduced himself, some instinct built from the careful way Maren's voice used to go flat whenever his name came up. He was tall, put together in the deliberate way of a man who'd always relied on being put together to get by, and he looked around my workshop with the mild distaste of someone assessing a place he considered beneath him. "I'm looking for Maren Delacroix," he said. "Someone at the hardware store said she spends a lot of time out here." "She does," I said, not offering anything further. He studied me a moment, recalculating, the way men like Colton always recalculate once they realize a conversation isn't unfolding the way they'd planned it. "You're the furniture guy. Right, the one everyone in town's been talking about." He said it with a faint, unpleasant amusement, like the idea offended some part of him he hadn't examined too closely. "I heard she's been spending a lot of time down here. Didn't realize it had gotten this serious." "It's serious," I said. "What do you want with her, Colton?" Something flickered across his face at hearing his own name in my mouth. A brief, unsettled recognition that she'd talked about him to me. "I want to see her. I've had some time to think, and I realize I made a mistake walking away when things got hard. I want to try again, properly this time." "You had 4 years to think about it," I said, keeping my voice level even though something cold and still had settled in my chest. "You waited until she stopped needing anyone to save her before deciding you wanted back in." "That's not fair," he said, some of the polish slipping. "It was a lot, all at once. The hospital, the therapy, watching her." He stopped himself, but not soon enough. "Watching her what?" I asked quietly. "Struggle? Change? Become somebody who didn't need you to feel like a hero anymore?" He didn't answer that, which told me everything I needed to know. And it was in that silence that Maren herself appeared in the workshop doorway, having come by for her usual evening visit, stopping dead when she saw who was standing in the middle of my floor. "Colton," she said, and her voice had gone flat and careful in the old way I hadn't heard in weeks, the mask sliding back into place so fast it made my chest ache to watch it happen. "Maren." He crossed toward her, hands out like he expected an embrace that wasn't coming. "You look wonderful. I mean that. I should have said it a long time ago, instead of just disappearing the way I did." "You should have said a lot of things a long time ago," she said, not moving from the doorway. "What are you doing here?" "I made a mistake," he said, and to his credit or his shame, his voice did crack slightly on the words. "I panicked, back then. I wasn't strong enough for what you needed, and instead of admitting that, I told myself it was easier for both of us if I just stepped back. I've had 4 years to understand how wrong that was. I want a second chance, Maren. I still love you." I watched her face carefully, braced for whatever came next, and what came next surprised even me with how steady it was. She stepped fully into the workshop, closing the distance between herself and Colton with the same deliberate, unhurried gait she used on uneven gravel, chin level, shoulders square. "You didn't love a person who might struggle," she said. "You loved the version of me that made your life easy. The second that version disappeared, so did you. I spent a long time thinking that made me the problem, that I'd become someone too difficult to love. It took me 4 years and a furniture restorer with more patience than sense to understand that wasn't true. I wasn't the problem, Colton. I was just no longer convenient." Colton's jaw tightened, the polish finally cracking all the way through. He glanced at me, something like contempt flickering across his face. "And this is easier? A guy who fixes broken chairs in a barn?" "Nothing about loving me was ever supposed to be easy," Maren said, before I could answer for myself. "That was always the part you got wrong. You wanted easy." He never once asked for easy. "I could give you a life," Colton pressed, some of his old confidence returning now that he'd found a thread to pull. "The kind we planned before. A house, not an apartment over a workshop. Stability. I have stability," Maren said. "It just doesn't come with your name on the mortgage anymore. It comes from a man who fixed a doorway because he couldn't stand watching me struggle through it. Not because he thought struggling made me less worth loving. He doesn't fix broken things because they're easy, Maren said, and I watched her reach back without looking, finding my hand with the same certainty she navigated every uneven surface in her life, and lace her fingers through mine. He fixes them because he understands what's worth the trouble. You never did. Colton stood there a long moment, looking between the two of us, and whatever he'd driven 3 hours expecting to happen, it clearly wasn't this. Finally he exhaled, some of the fight going out of him, replaced by something that might almost have been genuine regret. I really am sorry, Maren, for all of it. I know, she said, and her voice had softened just slightly, not with forgiveness exactly, but with the particular piece of someone who no longer needed an apology to feel whole. I hope you find whatever it is you actually need. I stopped needing you to be part of that a long time ago. He left without another word, and the workshop was quiet a long time after his car pulled out of the gravel lot. The two of us standing there hand in hand amid sawdust and half-finished projects, until Maren finally let out a breath that seemed to release something she'd been holding for 4 years straight. I used to think I'd feel something bigger if he ever came back, she said. Vindicated, maybe, angry. I just feel tired. And relieved. That's allowed, I said. Doesn't have to be bigger than what it actually is. She turned to face me fully then, tears standing in her eyes but not falling, and reached up to rest her palm against my jaw the way she'd started doing in quiet moments over the past weeks, like she was checking that I was real. You never once tried to save me from anything, she said. Not from the doorway, not from Colton, not from myself. You just kept showing up and calling it noticing. I think that's the first time in 4 years anyone's loved me without trying to fix me first. You were never broken, I said. Just carrying more than any one person should carry alone. I only ever wanted to help carry it. There's a difference. She kissed me then, slow and certain, and when she pulled back she rested her forehead against mine, the careful mask gone entirely now. Nothing left between us but the particular quiet of two people who'd finally stopped bracing for the other one to leave. Later that same night, after the workshop had gone dark and quiet again, we sat together on the porch steps of the apartment above the shop, her leg propped on a folded blanket, watching the last of the storm light fade over the hollow. She was quiet a long while before she spoke. I kept a version of myself ready to leave. This whole time, she admitted. Packed in a way that had nothing to do with boxes. I told myself it was practical. Better to expect people to go than be surprised when they did. I didn't even notice I was doing it with you until today, watching you stand there and not flinch once. I noticed, I said. Didn't say anything, because I figured you needed to find your own way to put it down, not have somebody point at it. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a long while neither of us said anything else. Just watched the fireflies start up along the tree line, the hollow settling into the particular hush that comes after a storm has finally passed through and left everything a little cleaner than it found it. The months that followed moved with an unhurried steadiness neither of us questioned. Maren kept the bookkeeping job, kept caring for her father, but she also, slowly, started running again. Not competitively, not the way she used to, but easy trail loops behind my workshop most mornings before her shift. Wearing a running blade I helped her research and pay for out of the restoration jobs I'd started taking on double, because some things are worth the extra hours. The first morning she ran the full loop without stopping, she came back into the workshop flushed and grinning in a way I hadn't seen in any of the old photographs, and didn't say a word, just pulled me into a hug still damp with sweat that I wouldn't have traded for anything. Her father took to me slowly, the way careful men take to anyone new around a daughter they'd already watched get hurt once. But by autumn he'd started leaving his porch light on for me on the evenings I drove Maren home, and eventually invited me to Sunday dinners where he told long stories about her childhood that made her groan and hide her face, and, eventually, laugh along with the rest of us. She moved a few things into the apartment above the shop that autumn, not all at once, the way people move in when they're still testing whether a place will hold them, but steadily, until one day I looked around and realized her toothbrush, and her running shoes and a framed photo of her grandmother had simply become part of how the space looked, Permanent in the way things become permanent without anybody announcing it. I finally got around to leveling that uneven threshold at the barn door, sanding and shimming it flush over a slow Sunday afternoon while she sat on the same stool she'd claimed as hers months earlier, offering unhelpful commentary and laughing every time I swore at a stubborn joint. When I finished, I ran my hand along the smooth new transition and looked up to find her watching me with an expression I'd come to recognize as the particular quiet look she wore when she was working up to say something important. "You didn't have to fix that," she said. "I've made peace with a lot of uneven ground in 4 years." "I know I didn't have to," I said. "Wanted to. There's a difference between what a person can manage and what they shouldn't have to manage alone." Figured I could at least handle the doorway. It was there, on that repaired threshold, the barn door open behind us letting in the last gold light of a September evening, that I finally asked her to marry me. No elaborate speech, no crowd, just the two of us in a doorway I'd fixed because I loved her, and a rocking chair in the corner that had once been broken too. She said yes before I'd even gotten fully down on one knee, laughing through tears the same way she had the day Colton left, and when I slid the ring onto her finger she looked past me, into the workshop, at that same rocking chair sitting finished, and whole in its corner where it had waited out our entire courtship. "That chair," she said softly. "I brought it in broken, because I couldn't stand watching one more piece of my grandmother get thrown away like it wasn't worth saving." I didn't know I was about to learn the same thing could be true about me. "Some things just need the right person willing to do the work," I said, pulling her close against the cooling evening air. "Turns out that goes both ways." She laughed, wet and full, and turned in my arms to look back at the chair one more time before we walked, together, unhurried, back through the doorway that no longer had a single uneven edge left for either of us to navigate around.